Today, we're going to break down a geopolitical crisis that, on paper, should have absolutely crippled China's economy. But instead, Beijing managed to turn a massive vulnerability into an incredibly powerful weapon. So how on earth did they pull it off? Okay, let's set the scene. Imagine it's the year 2026. Global tensions are already sky high, and then Washington suddenly launches surprise attacks, first against Venezuela, and then, shortly after, against Iran. The whole world is basically holding its breath. Well, Tehran doesn't just sit there. In retaliation, it does the one thing everyone feared. It blocks the Strait of Hormuz. They threaten to fire on any ship that even tries to pass through. And just like that, boom, global energy prices shoot through the roof, kicking off a massive worldwide economic crisis. Now this should be an unmitigated disaster for China. I mean, they're the single largest importer of crude oil on the entire planet. And yet, Beijing seems strangely, almost unnervingly calm. And that is the central mystery we're going to unravel today. So first, let's just establish why this crisis really should have brought China's whole economy to a grinding halt. Just look at this chart. It lays China's exposure completely bare. Over half, more than 50%, of all its oil imports come through that now closed Strait of Hormuz. And another 20%, that comes from Iran and Venezuela, the very two countries that are now under attack. You couldn't write a more perfect storm. And listen, this isn't just a China problem. To really get the scale of this, you have to understand that a full fifth, 20%, of the entire world's daily oil supply is now just choked off. This blockage is sending absolute shockwaves through every major economy on the globe. You know, given just how dependent China looks on paper, some analysts have even floated the idea that this was the entire point, that the real target of the U.S. operation wasn't really Tehran at all, but that it was a calculated bank shot designed specifically to cripple Beijing. So with its main energy lifeline just completely severed, you'd expect total panic, right? Frantic phone calls, economic chaos. But instead, what we see from Beijing is this quiet, measured response. And why? Because this wasn't a surprise to them. Not at all. They've been preparing for this exact scenario for more than a decade. The very first piece of their strategy was to build a massive defensive barrier. Think of it like a Great Wall, but instead of stone, this one's made of oil. And this wasn't some recent panicked reaction. This has been a long-term strategic project. I mean, they started way back in 2012, systematically buying up more oil than they needed every single day and just squirreling it away. They even used the sanctions on Russia to get it at a discount. And as U.S. policy got more aggressive, they just accelerated their buying, building this huge emergency reserve. And what this gives them is an incredible buffer. For 4 solid months, 120 days, China could stop importing oil entirely and still function almost normally. This reserve lets them just ride out the initial shock, absorb the impact over time, and crucially, avoid making any panicked decisions from a position of weakness. But you know, those stockpiles, that's just the first layer of their defense. The real secret to China's calm, the thing that makes them fundamentally different from every other major developed economy, lies in this unique, almost backward-looking energy strategy. So to really get what China did, think about the typical energy journey that most Western economies took. You know, it was a 3-step process. First, you had the coal-powered industrial age. Then came the more efficient, but geopolitically messy oil and gas age. And now, of course, there's this big push towards renewables. Okay, and this right here, this is China's masterstroke. They essentially just skipped phase 2. While countries like Italy and Germany depend on oil and gas for something like 70% of their energy, China still gets a staggering 60% of its energy from good old-fashioned coal. Their actual dependency on oil and gas for power generation is only about 20%. So a global oil price shock just doesn't hit their electrical grid in the same devastating way. But here's the really genius part. While they're sticking with coal for their baseline power, they are simultaneously leaping directly into phase 3. In 2024 alone, China was responsible for over 80% of all new renewable energy capacity added in the entire world. They're literally using the past to power their present, all while building the future. Now, all this resilience is pretty impressive, but believe it or not, it's only half the story. The final part of the strategy is where China completely flips the script, from defense to offense. And this brings us right back to our core paradox. We just established that China doesn't really depend on oil for its energy grid, right? So why on earth are they the world's #1 importer of crude oil? I mean, why go to all the trouble of buying and stockpiling a resource that isn't really essential for keeping the lights on back home? Well, the answer is all about processing. See, China isn't just a consumer of crude oil, it's a massive refiner. They bring in these huge amounts of raw crude, they refine it into high value products. Think gasoline, diesel, plastics, and then they sell those finished goods to the rest of the world, especially their neighbors in Asia. They are a net exporter of refined petroleum products. So, this crisis, for them, it becomes a massive business opportunity. While all their economic rivals are getting crippled by soaring energy costs, China can just dip into its stockpiles, keep its refineries humming, and sell vital products into a desperate market. Suddenly, the US starts to look like an unreliable partner, and China, with its stable energy situation, looks like a much more attractive place for international companies to invest. So, through decades of quiet, careful preparation, China has engineered a situation where a crisis designed to weaken it could actually end up making it stronger. But this entire strategy, this whole advantage, it relies on projecting an image of reliability and stability. And that, well, that brings us to one final critical question. Could this entire carefully constructed advantage be thrown away if Beijing decides that this is the moment to make an aggressive move on Taiwan? Now, that's something to think about.